Prenup. What a scary term. Nothing takes the romance out of dreams of happily ever after like the prospect of divorce, particularly divorce where you hire attorneys to talk about how you're going to protect yourselves from each other. But there is another way. What if the prenup conversation became about how you and your future spouse plan to take care of each other rather than protect yourselves from each other, whether you divorce or stay together for the rest of your lives? Hi, I am Kate Scharf, host of Divorce on Planet Earth, real world advice for well-intentioned humans. Today, we are joined by family law attorney Suzy Eckstein, who will explain how to turn a prenup conversation on its head, how to turn it into a non-adversarial process that reduces anxiety, strengthens emotional bonds, including those with your friends and your extended families, and sets you up for success. Before we start, I have some news to share. This is our first show back after a long COVID hiatus. And like many of you, my co-host Jane Pralinger and I have been doing a lot of soul searching about life, about our priorities, and about where it makes sense to put our professional energies. Jane runs a thriving private practice and her own therapy training institute. And after a lot of thought and angst, she has decided to leave her post here as co-host of the podcast so she can focus on the other things that she loves to do. I will miss her and she will miss us, but she has promised to come back now and again as a guest, which she will do a great job at. We love you, Jane. Suzy Eckstein is a family law practitioner in Rockville, Maryland, and is barred in both Maryland and the District of Columbia. Among her many distinctions and posts, she is an adjunct professor of law at the Maryland School of Law, and she is a national leader in the field of collaborative divorce. And she's been here before to talk about that and other divorce processes. So we're happy to have her back. Welcome back, Suzy.
Oh, it's good to be back, Kate. Thanks.
Sure. Prenup is kind of a heavy word, I think, and it strikes anxiety and sometimes fear in the heart of marrying couples or perhaps one member of a marrying couple. I hear phrases all the time like, hope you had a prenup. Can you believe he didn't ask for a prenup? Is that your experience of people that they come to you worried about the process?
Yeah, I think that a prenup has, in general, at least up, hopefully we're going to shift that, but up till now, a very negative connotation. Most people think about divorce as the first reason, and it feels bad to be thinking about divorce when you're in the throes of love and getting married and all those things that go with it. And they also think about this is a document that somebody's trying to protect something of their own, and that doesn't feel good to them.
But you have a very different way of thinking about prenups. It's a positive way. Tell us about it.
So the way I think about prenups is that it really is about having those conversations that you should be having before you get married to figure out, how you're going to live your life with each other. And those are positive conversations. When I think of prenups, the last thing I think about is divorce. Okay, if you've done a prenup and you've talked about all those things that you should have talked about before you got married anyway, maybe you put something in there about divorce. Sometimes people do prenups and they don't address divorce. They're really thinking about how can they protect each other if somebody dies or what they're going to do during their lives. So it is an important conversation or series of conversations to have before you marry somebody.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the different parts of that conversation? What would you recommend that people be thinking about?
I think about it in sort of three ways, three parts. There's a legal event. They're getting married and how they're going to handle things in different situations from a legal perspective. There's the financial perspective, which really a lot of the conversations often center around and people's different perspectives and how they're going to handle those and marry them literally together. And then there's the emotional piece, which is one of the largest pieces, I would say. How are you going to live your lives? Are you going to have children? Is somebody going to stay home? Do you believe in saving for retirement? How do you envision your lives going forward while you're married? Who's going to pay for what? So So there are, and those things all have emotional things attached to them. How people grew up informs the conversation, what they, whether they liked the way their life was when they grew up or not. And really, those are the things that you talk about in order to, one, figure out if this is the right mate for you. And hopefully you've decided that by that time that you can learn how to navigate those conversations that could be difficult.
It's interesting, these are people who presumably have been together for some time. Do you find that the couples that come to you haven't already had this kind of conversation that you're describing?
So more and more, I find that people have touched on these topics. I think it's more encouraged. There's more information out there and thinking about finances, et cetera. But there are most people, I would say most people haven't had these kind of conversations. There are many issues that people should think about and discuss that can go in a prenup or not, but there's still things that should be discussed. So for instance, how are you going to handle things that you each had before the marriage? Sometimes people each have a business that they've been working on and nurturing for years. Maybe one party has a business and the other party needs to, is going to give up their job and help in the business. And what does that look like in the future? Really, it's about how they're going to take care of each other and maybe other members of their family, whether that be children they already have or children they're going to have in the future, or sometimes even extended family. How they're going to pay for things during their marriage. Are they going to go on expensive vacations, not expensive vacations? There's so many different issues that they need to discuss, and people often don't talk about those things. And when they sit in my office, often what happens is somebody comes with an agreement that was drafted by the other attorney, and they sit down, they're like, oh, I just want you to look at this and make sure it's okay. And when I start asking them questions, well, did you think about what you would do in this situation, or how you're going to handle things for, paying for things? And they're really surprised. They're like, no, I didn't think about that, but I really can see how we need to talk about that. So there are just many different conversations. And yes, one of them might be if they get divorced. But one of the most important conversations is what happens if one of us passes. How are we going to take care of each other? How are the children going to be taken care of? And these are conversations that should happen. They're going to shift, right? Their perspectives, life changes us. So we often put in an agreement that they will sit down once a year and have a conversation about finances or how they're going to handle things going forward, because it is a constantly shifting landscape. So even if couples have had these conversations before they come to us to draft a prenup, they may be rethinking them at that point when marriage is, a reality in front of them.
So it sounds like you're suggesting that this is just the first of many conversations. It's a facilitated version of a conversation that you recommend people have on a regular basis. I don't know if you suggest they do an annual, financial tune-up kind of conversation.
So we do, especially when it seems like people they need a lot of information. Sometimes people come to us and they're fairly financially savvy. They already have a financial advisor that they've been talking to, but most people come to us and haven't really thought these things through. And sometimes they're surprised. Like one person a lot of us are like this. If you don't, you might think a certain amount of money is a lot of money till you go talk to your financial advisor. And so you need to plan, okay, what are we going to do? We don't have as much as I thought. And that is something you should be thinking about yearly. I would say even doing a budget. I always say to my clients in all facets of family law that I'm working with, not just prenups, you need to do the budget. It's the hardest thing you'll do, but it's the best thing you'll do. Then the most important, because it informs what each of you are thinking about as far as what you're going to spend going forward. And then you can talk about how you're going to manage that.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like you're talking about developing a shared understanding, a sort of shared narrative of this is how we're going to conduct things. So this is how these are the areas that we've sort of agreed on for now. Do you find that there is sometimes a real difference, a conceptual difference in how life will be lived or finances will be managed that you then have to work with?
So I think it happens both ways. Sometimes people are on the same page about most things, and then there's some piece that they're not on the same page about. But many times, more times often than not, what people say is, I really haven't thought about that, or we haven't talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they realize that they should have.
Yeah.
And so it's hopefully they've talked about doing this prenup in enough time to have those conversations without encroaching on the wedding, because that's often an issue. So people really need to think about the timing. The time to do a prenup is not 2 weeks before the wedding. It's 6 months before the wedding.
Mm-hmm.
Because you need to have time to have these conversations and work them through in a good way, in a positive way.
And process the feelings that come up, I imagine.
Yes, I have had couples where they have had some different perspectives, but they've already been working with a couples counselor, which I think is, for me, that bodes well. That's probably the most stable marriage, is people who realize that they need some assistance if they have differences and having conversations, and they've already spent some time working on it. And so it is, if they haven't, then I might suggest we bring in a mental health professional as support to facilitate the discussion and get them on the right track of learning some tools of how to deal with their different perspectives.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I had been thinking that, in a way, what the process that you're describing sounds like premarital counseling, which some couples do, either with a mental health professional or with a clergy person, but it's not therapy. Though it does have a counseling component, whether you have a mental health professional or not. It sounds like.
Yeah, it's not therapy, but it does highlight the different perspectives, and people need to think about, how are we going to handle that? Sometimes they can sit down and easily talk to each other, and sometimes they realize they need help. Sometimes it's the attorneys who are involved who help them with that conversation by helping them think about options, and sometimes they might need a little bit more help, but that's not a negative thing, because you can learn tools. That is one of the most important things you can learn, is what are the tools? Because that no matter how well people are doing with each other, as life goes on and life changes, they're going to have differences. They might think about things that they thought about now in a different way at a later time.
Yeah, I wonder what you think about this. I've noticed in doing work with couples who are already in committed relationships, married or not, but are doing things that are financially intertwined, that often marital difficulties that are more general kind of hide out in the finances, sort of the way they do in sex, and that finances are often even more difficult to talk about than sex. And sometimes it's kind of in the actual mechanics that you see the difficulties. So I usually do ask about how couples handle their finances in couple therapy. And sometimes they'll say, well, we have everything separate. So they don't have any shared accounts, and maybe one pays one set of expenses and the other pays another set of expenses. And they really don't have any idea necessarily where the rest of the money is going. And I ask about why, and they say they don't know, or, well, we don't want to intertwine our finances. But in fact, what they don't know is a lot. They're not thinking about the fact that what they're accumulating during the marriage, actually, it's intertwined, whether they have similar, shared accounts or not.
Well, it's intertwined from a legal perspective for sure, because once they get married, and if somebody passes away, let's not even talk about divorce, then there are certain rights that attach to that separate property. So it's kind of considered part of the mix, although there are some new rules in Maryland lately regarding that. But so there's so many things to think about, but I think what comes out when you talk about finances and how much money you're going to spend is how you your philosophy of life. Like, are you a saver?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to plan for retirement, or do you just want to live for for the now? And so finances bring up those issues, and highlight the perspectives that people have. And that's a good thing, because then they have a chance to talk about it and work it through and compromise and figure out options that might work for both of them.
Yeah, that sounds very important. I was thinking when you talked about the importance of leaving time to have this conversation, not in a rush at the 11th hour before the wedding, about the role that extended family can sometimes play as a kind of Greek chorus, giving their family member advice, potentially warning, especially if it's if there's a big delta between what resources one partner brings to the marriage and what resources the other partner brings. If there are children from a previous marriage, if there's a family business, a large inheritance coming, that kind of thing, and dealing with the emotional aspects of family wealth and family feelings, that must be an important aspect of this work.
So I think especially when people are in a second marriage and they have children from a previous relationship, or just getting married for the first time, have children from a previous relationship. And, there are different stages that I think about this. So adult children, if you have adult children from a previous relationship, it is natural for those adult children to be concerned when their parent is remarrying somebody that they don't know what that means for their future. Whether that person's going to try and take advantage or not take advantage, or what is it going to look like? Am I still going to get some help from my mom? What happens if my mom passes away? Does this other person get all her stuff? Like, it just brings up so many feelings for adult children. What I think about prenups as a way to help the family sort of manage those feelings and create an environment where the relationships can flourish, so that the adult children can have a sense of, okay, maybe they don't need to know all the details, maybe they do, but that there's something in place, that mom has talked to her new partner, or dad has talked to his new partner about all these things that I'm worried about, and they've worked it out in a way that they both feel comfortable with, and will either take care of us, or this is what it looks like. And I think it's helpful to talk to adult children actually about what it does look like, but at the very least, that they know there's something in place and that these issues have been addressed. The other thing is, there are often, when you have parents who have a lot of wealth and their child is getting married and they want to pass on their wealth to that child, they are concerned. I mean, it can help them, whether you take care of that concern or not, is up to you, but a prenup can help alleviate that concern. And again, I think help the relationships flourish, because there's just not a worry about it. It's, at the very least, all the issues have been discussed.
This makes me wonder about the role of thinking about estate planning in discussions of the issues you're talking about. Can you say a little bit about wills and the difference between estate planning and prenuptial planning?
Yeah, it's often confusing, and I found I do a lot of estate planning in my practice. That's a big part of my practice. There are a lot of family law attorneys who don't, and so they not necessarily understanding the interplay. Certainly their clients not necessarily understanding the interplay. Like, this is something I might hear. Well, we can just talk about how we're going to leave things to each other and take care of that in our wills. We don't need to discuss that in the prenup. First thing is what I go back to, and I've always saying that that's a conversation you should have before you get married, for sure. Whether you include it in your prenup again or not is up to you, but you should have that conversation. But if you don't include it in your prenup, then you can do wills that reflect what each of you agree, but you need to understand that without that contract saying this is the way you'll do it, which is what a prenup is, it's a contract, then somebody could change their will down the line. And when you do a will, you're not bound unless there's a contract behind it, like a prenup, to keep your will that way. If you do have a prenup and you change your will in the future and it doesn't reflect what's in that contract, then that prenup is going to override what you've done in your estate planning. So you need to understand, that's an important point to sort of understand. But estate planning is one of the major pieces, besides how you're going to live your life during the marriage and what you do with your stuff you had before the marriage. How are you going to take care of each other? And I think of it that way, not how you're going to protect your assets from the other person, but how are you going to take care of each other? So for instance, one person might own the house that the other person moves into. And there's no talk about whether or not you're going to change the title to joint. And so if you're a couple who's a little later in life, you might think, well, if something happens when one of us dies, like I want my children from my first marriage to get their share. I don't want them to have to wait. And so the house will be sold. Well, that might be fine, depending where everybody is in life. But you have to remember that what happens is that home becomes the other person's home. And it's not, there's a lot of emotion attached to that. So there's different options for taking care of that. One is to give the person some time to live there. It could be a year, which gives them time to sort of grieve and then figure out where they're going. It could be 2 years, it could be 5 years, or it could be they get to stay there until they don't want to stay there anymore. And then it's sold, or they pass away. So there's different ways to handle it. The other piece to think about is when you have young children. If you have young children and the other person, the person dies, then you may not want to move out of the house because these kids, they go to school there. This is where their friends are. So it's not just if you're older, it's, you have to think about it at all stages of life.
It occurs to me that also time changes lots of things about how people feel about each other and their sense of ownership. That I think things can really shift. They may go into the marriage thinking, well, this is money that my parents sweated for, or this is money that I worked my tail off to earn, and I'm not going to feel like sharing it. But 10 years later, when they've both been making a contribution to the marriage, whether it's financial or in kind, they may feel very differently about it.
Yeah, so prenups can be amended to reflect changes in your thinking, for sure. Sometimes in prenups, there are time limits, like they last, and people think, well, if our marriage lasts for 10 years, for 20 years, then we're good. And whatever happens, happens, and we don't need this prenup anymore. And they specifically say that in the prenup, that it's no longer in force after 20 years or 10 years or whatever the time period is. The other thing that people can do in a prenup is think about those different stages in life and make changes in increments in the prenup to begin with. After 5 years or 10 years, then if I pass away, then I will give more out of my estate, to take care of this person, because now maybe they stayed home with the children and they don't have the resources that they would have had otherwise. And so in order to sort of reflect that family value, that once that's happened, we will make a shift, and that shift is already spelled out.
Susie, are there other things besides death that could trigger a change in the prenup that is written into the prenup?
As time goes on, people may, if you're living in a home together, and it's titled in one person's name or even both your names, you might have an agreement about how the equity is divided if something happens to one of you. People often will put in sort of a step up in, what the equity, the other person would have an interest in as time goes on.
We've been talking about changes that are anticipated, changes that a couple may decide to make as they go along. Can you talk about how changing a prenup is different from putting a postnup?
What's important to know about that is when you make changes to a prenup or if you do a postnup, meaning you're already married, you have to think about whether those changes are something that there's a give and take. So this is sort of a technical, contracts have to have what we say consideration. That means you give up something, I give up something, or I give something and you give something. So it can't be a one-way street. Whereas technically, when you're doing a prenuptial agreement, the consideration is just the fact that you're getting married. One person could technically give up everything and the other person could give up nothing, and it still could be a valid prenup. Now, that again, that gets a little bit tricky because sometimes prenups can be set aside if they're found completely unconscionable, meaning one person had $20 million, the other person had $1, and they agreed that the other person would stay home, take care of the kids, not work, not increase their skills in any way. And it didn't matter 20 years from now, the person who had 20 million wouldn't owe the other person a dime. That probably would be set aside as unconscionable. So
you're saying if one member of the couple they get divorced and one member of the couple decides to challenge the prenup.
That's correct.
There are situations in which a judge might decide that it's not fair.
It is rare, but there are circumstances. And so what's helpful when my clients come to me, and let's say I have the client who is interested in getting a prenup, and what I often hear is the other person's not going to get an attorney. It feels very unromantic to them to have two attorneys involved because the automatic assumption is that's going to be an adversarial relationship, because that's sort of what I think still society thinks about, that attorneys have an adversarial relationship. And so the other person's like, I don't need an attorney. I trust you. The problem with that is then that person doesn't have the opportunity to really think through all these issues that I would be raising with my client. There's nobody raising them with them. And they later may say, oh, I didn't even think about that. And it's easier to set aside a prenup if you don't both have attorneys.
You mean a judge is more likely?
A judge is more likely to set things aside. So I do always encourage my clients to have their spouse-to-be get an attorney that can be part of the conversation. And when I say that, part of the conversation, that the way I look at it is very different, I think, than the way it's been traditionally done.
Well, maybe this is a good time for you to talk a little bit more specifically about process options for doing the prenup. I'm sure a lot of listeners are thinking, how would I even go about beginning? It sounds like Suzy is saying we should both be represented, even though that might feel bad. It may feel like we're not trusting each other. But on the ground, what are the options for people?
So one option is sort of the traditional way, which is one attorney just writes the agreement and gives it to their client, gives it to the other client or person, the spouse-to-be. I won't say client because they may not have an attorney yet. And that person can decide whether they take it to an attorney or not. And they do that without any pre-conversation. Another option is for that person to come to me and I give them information on what issues they need to talk about with their spouse-to-be, and they have those conversations. And then my client comes back to me and I write that up. And then again, the other person can decide whether or not they go to an attorney, although at each turn I'm encouraging that to happen. And then one way is to have the attorneys connect with each other as well as the spouses. So what I like to do, and it really mirrors the collaborative process, which I've talked with you about in the past, where each party has an attorney who is dedicated to thinking about the interests of both parties, and they work with each other. So they each talk to their clients, maybe one time separately, to sort of figure out what help them articulate their goals. And then the attorneys connect with each other to say, okay, what's the best way to set them up for success in these conversations? Are there ones that they can have on their own? Are there ones that we should have all together? Do they need help, a facilitation maybe with a mental health professional to have some of the more difficult conversations? And just figure out the best way to help them, and then help them develop what they need to talk about what information they need to figure out the answers to what they need to talk about, and then talk about options that might help intersect their interests.
Yes, you talked about collaborative divorce in a really wonderful episode that aired it before our COVID hiatus, and I encourage people to listen both to that episode and to the episode that we aired right before that, where you talk about the whole range of process options. That was divorce related, but I think you even say in that episode that the collaborative approach is applicable in lots of processes. And now we're learning, including prenup discussions. And, there are many important things about collaborative that you're highlighting now, including that it's an approach in which both attorneys are interested in the needs of everyone involved, that there is an expectation going in that people will be transparent, and that if there's ever any litigation, I guess, including the challenging of a prenup, that your attorneys cannot go to court with you, which is actually turns out to be a good thing.
I mean, it really, to me, the most important piece of that process, all those things that you're talking about are important. And we do talk to our clients about transparency, and in every context, but especially in this context, is that the parties and the attorneys and any other professionals that are there to support the parties, like maybe a financial neutral to help them work through the finances and how they're going to handle it, are working together to come up with solutions that will work for both parties. Financial neutrals can be particularly helpful. I've had many cases where clients have worked with a financial neutral to talk through the different finances and what does our life look like if one of us doesn't work when we have children, or even when folks are older and somebody's been working and the other person is ready to retire and wants the person who's still working actively to retire also, to travel with them. And what does that mean to their future together and how they handle finances, especially if one of them passes?
I should probably ask you, for people who are wondering, why wouldn't they just mediate? Why wouldn't they get one attorney to help them do their prenup, and then perhaps take the draft to separate attorneys just to review it?
Mediation is done with a neutral who is not there to give advice about how things might fall out legally, and to talk to each person individually about what they should be thinking about. It's really just to help facilitate the conversation between the two of them. Now, the person might give topics for them to talk about. I think that it is not, it really depends on how much support folks need in a conversation. I've seen in many cases, especially, which I think really bodes well for the couple's future, is they go to a mental health professional to sort of talk about the emotional issues and what life might look like together. And they go to a financial person to talk about what they've worked out in their philosophy of moving forward. What is that going to look like? And how can they achieve their goals from a financial perspective? And are their goals realistic? Also talking to an estate planning attorney about what can be done and what can't be done going forward can be helpful, and then pulling the pieces all together. So getting support from other professionals, whether it's through the collaborative process specifically, or whether you go to a mediator, a neutral, and then you use those other pieces that you've worked with to pull it together. Getting support is good. It just bodes well for thinking about giving yourself ways and options to handle things in the future, and tools that you can use to handle things in the future.
It may sound to listeners like you're suggesting a lot of cooks in the kitchen, but I think you and I, who both work in the collaborative world, have experienced it very differently. That it's not less efficient or necessarily even more expensive, that it's each professional doing the thing that they're very good at, rather than the attorneys trying to do everything.
That's right. The pieces, it can be done much more efficiently, and establishing a relationship with a financial person going forward is very important. And I think that it's more efficient. It also gives you more tools for your future so that you don't run into these problems as much in the future. Some people, are already having these conversations. Sometimes I have folks come to me who both of them have already been through that sort of bad divorce, and they know what they want things to look like. They know they want to provide something so their spouse doesn't feel like they're going to get kicked out of the house that the other person owns. So they want to provide for them and they want them to feel comfortable. And they've already had all these conversations because they know a lot of the pitfalls. They have adult children who have already expressed their concerns. They could have already figured it out. But what I want to say is, don't shy away from doing a prenup. You might find that you have differences because the time to talk about them is now, and then next year, and the year after that. And whether or not, again, you reflect that in writing is up to you. If you want it to be legally binding, you have to reflect it in writing. But you may decide, at least, well, we've had these conversations and we've navigated them well. So maybe we won't have a prenup, or maybe we'll only address certain pieces, like if we pass away, what's going to happen, so we can sort of help our children feel comfortable with each other, our children from our previous relationships, and with each of us.
It's interesting. What you're describing is something that I've certainly found to be true, which is it's the things you don't talk about that end up causing trouble. So people may come to this conversation that you're describing with lots of assumptions and a lot of anxiety associated with those assumptions about their partner. And then in the process of having the conversation, yes, there might be difficult parts of the conversation, but I bet that people actually feel reassured, that they find that their partner is worried too, but actually underneath that they want to do right by each other.
I often find that the people who come to me with the most difficult, sort of thorny, different perspectives or understanding, and they haven't talked about those things, that they feel so much better. Like you're going into this marriage feeling like, okay, I knew that was going to be thorny. I was worried about it, but now I figured out a way to do it. And so I don't have to get married and then be anxious about that. I can actually enjoy this wedding and thinking about the future because we've already tackled that thorny issue. And maybe it'll come up again in a different way, but we did it once. So we can do this. I find that a lot.
Mr. Rogers said, if it's mentionable, it's manageable.
There you go. And that is for sure.
I'm kind of blown away. This is really a major paradigm shift that you're describing, away from treating the prenup conversation as something adversarial or potentially adversarial into something that is intended to set a couple up for success. And I wonder, if people are thinking, well, that sounds great, but that's Suzy. That's Suzy Eckstein. There's nobody else like Suzy Eckstein. And I wonder if you have any advice for people who really like what you're talking about and want a process like this, but wouldn't know how to find attorneys who would want to do this.
Yeah, so I think that it's like finding any other professional. You want to interview a couple of professionals to make sure that what their philosophy is. Somebody that talks to you in a way that, that highlights what we're saying, that they're going to help you navigate the differences in a non-adversarial way, in a collaborative way. You don't have to work necessarily with a collaboratively trained attorney, although I think that is a good place to start if you're not sure where to go. But I've worked with many attorneys who just get the idea that we're setting couple up for life and to work through these things that are differences, and that it's not to create strife between them. I find more attorneys understand that what we're doing is setting folks up for their future and helping them and giving them tools and making sure they talk about the important issues and not just sweep them under the rug for later.
That is wonderful advice. And some other wonderful advice that I've heard you give many times is to hire a lawyer who asks questions rather than imposes an agenda that makes you feel understood, comfortable, and less anxious than you felt when you walked in the door.
Yes, for sure. And I've seen people who are more anxious about doing this piece, doing a prenup, or having those conversations, I really think is what is behind it, not necessarily the prenup. They're more anxious than most of the clients who walk through my door about, with different issues, because it's so laden with the emotions as well as any financial and legal issues. And you're talking about the rest of your life, looking at the rest of your life. So yeah, you definitely want to feel like you've been heard. And the best way to know that you're being heard is somebody who asks questions and really listens rather than talks at you. They have to give you some information at some point, but you need to be heard first.
Very good advice. Well, Susie, I want to thank you for joining us again and being so generous with your knowledge and your time, but most of all, your perspective. It's a wonderful perspective for people getting married and being married, or just being in relationship to other people.
Yeah, I think that's what it's all about. It's about thinking about relationships and how they're going to shift, and what you're going to do, and learning how to manage that.
Great. Well, I hope you'll come back and share more of yourself with us in the future. We will make some of the resources, some of the websites that you mentioned for finding good attorneys to help with prenups on our website, and certainly ways to contact you, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Great.
Thanks for having me, Kate.
Thanks for listening to Divorce on Planet Earth, Kate Sharf's real world advice for well-intentioned humans. We hope that what you've heard here will be helpful, but since everyone's situation is different, content is not intended as a substitute for clinical or personal advice or recommendations. If you'd like to know right away when I have a new episode, I invite you to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me on Twitter at Kate Sharf, or on Facebook, Kate Sharf, MSW, or on Instagram at Kate_Sharf. And pretty much everything that I think about and write about is on my website, katesharf.com. Talk to you next time.